All right, so we are in Daniel chapter 9, and last time we talked about verse 24. Spent the entire time just going through that verse, and I told you that I believe it refers to Jesus. So I'd like to read that again. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. And now, not everybody agrees with me about this, and I've been doing a lot of reading, so I know that they don't all agree. But I believe that when you get to verse 25, it's still the same subject. There's not a change here. So we've been talking about Jesus. Now let's go to verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. And I told you last week that word week in Hebrew is also the word 7. They were used interchangeably. And for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and a moat, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. So we won't cover everything in there tonight because I just didn't want to get bogged down in trying to fit too much in. So we'll come back next week and do some more. But I still think this is talking about Jesus, and that what God was doing here, speaking through the angel Gabriel, he was giving Daniel a timeline. And the timeline was this: beginning with the decree to rebuild Jerusalem until the death of Jesus, 483 years would elapse. And I'm going to try to explain why I think that. But I also, again, I want to repeat what I've been saying for some weeks now. When you get into passages like this that are inherently difficult to interpret, what I'm going to say now, this is my perspective. And I'm very likely to get some things wrong, and I understand that, and I expect it. So you've got to do your own thinking, and don't agree with it just because I say it. But I'm going to, again, share you what I think this passage is about. Now, and that's particularly true when it comes to the numbers and the references to weeks here in Daniel 9. Part of the reason I want to be careful, it has to do with the fact that this passage uses numbers in a kind of unusual way. So it's talking about weeks, it talks about a period of 7 weeks, it talks about a period of 62 weeks. That's in the middle of verse 25. Let's read it again. From the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. And for 62 weeks it shall be built again. Now, just so you know, I'm going to make the argument, and I'm pretty safe ground saying this, because most conservative scholars, much smarter than me, make the same argument. I'm going to make the argument that each of these weeks represents a period of 7 years. Now, so we have 69 weeks we've seen so far, right? There's the 7 weeks, there's the 62. And then if you keep reading in verse 26 at the beginning of verse 27, there's another week that gets added. So middle of verse 26, and the people of the prince, and we're not covering this, just the one part, who shall come to destroy the city and the sanctuary, its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war, desolations are decreed. He shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week. Okay? And for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. Now, so we've had 7 weeks and 62 weeks in verse 20, in verse 25 and 26, and then you get this 1 more week, and that brings you back to verse 24 at the beginning. It says 70 weeks are decreed. Okay? 7, 62, 1 equals 70. So when I was growing up in Assemblies of God churches, I was taught that these 70 weeks represented a literal period of 490 years. Okay? And as we go through this today and next week and maybe the week after that, I'm going to try to show it to you. I won't be able to cover it all today, but I'm going to try to show you why it makes sense for these weeks to mean 7-year periods. And essentially, it begins with the fact that if you just take this literally as weeks, 7-day periods, it doesn't fit with the timeline. It took years to rebuild Jerusalem, right? And then beyond that, from the time that decree started until Jesus came, it was again even many more years. And so that's why I'm starting with the argument that these are years. Okay, each week is 7 years. So let's go back now to the text in verse 25. Gabriel, the angel, told Daniel there would be a period of 69 weeks. And again, they're divided into two periods. There's one period of 7 weeks, which works out to 49 years, right? 7 weeks, each week representing 7 years. 7 times 7 is 49. And there's another period of 62 weeks. And if you do the math there, 62 times 7 works out to 434 years. And then let me read it. I know I'm doing a lot of reading, but I want you to see this. Verse 25, know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem, so that's where it starts, to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, so here's the period of time, there shall be 7 weeks. And then a new sentence, and for 62 weeks it shall be built again, with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. So you notice here what's happening in this period of time. Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt, and it's talking about squares and a moat. And there's a little bit of debate over exactly what those words mean in Hebrew. But essentially the word that's translated as squares is kind of a word that talks about a town center or a town plaza. And if you've ever been in towns in the Middle East, a lot of them are built even to this day because they're old. They're built around that central plaza. There's oftentimes an old well there from back in the day that sometimes is still in use. And it was a place where people came to get their water for the day and just to sit and visit during the periods of time when they had a little bit of free time. And so that's what that word square. It also can refer to streets that go around it. And then it uses the word moat. What on earth? Well, I think of a castle and a moat, right? And that's what the word means. It was a trench. Now, I'm going to get a little far afield here. In the Middle Ages, in Europe, when they had a moat around a castle, it was filled all the time because you never knew when invaders would come. In the Middle East, desert climate, not a lot of rainfall, it was the moat around a city was typically dry. It was a trench that was dug, and it was there, but it was typically dry because water was scarce, water was something to be conserved. But if they heard and had time to prepare that an enemy was coming, they would fill the trench and it would become a moat because it provided a line of defense against invaders. So that's what's going on here. And we have this 49-year period. But the number of 49 in years, it's kind of become a problem. And people were pointing out in my research, most of you know when Jerusalem was rebuilt, it was Nehemiah who led that effort. He was the one called by God to go and oversee the rebuilding. And when you read what he says about how long it took, he gives a different number. It's in Nehemiah 6, verse 15. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul in 52 days. Okay, so 49 years, 52 days, and people are like, well, it's not the same. Well, people aren't reading carefully. Nehemiah's words do not conflict with what God tells Daniel through Gabriel, because Nehemiah's work was just the beginning of the rebuilding. If you go through and read the book of Nehemiah carefully, essentially what he's focusing on is building the walls. They had been torn down, and that was his task. He was rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem so there'd be security for the city. And after that was done, the 52 days were done, that's when the rest of the rebuilding took place, and it took place over a period of several years. So there's not a conflict here. People that make that argument, it's because they're not paying attention to the details. And now, as I've been saying, I still think this is talking really about Jesus, because Gabriel continues and he tells Daniel there's going to be a 62-week period, which is 434 years, and from the time the decree is given to rebuild the Jerusalem until the death of the Messiah. And that's again in the beginning of verse 26. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. Now, why do I think this refers to Jesus? Because an anointed one sounds, maybe it could be Jesus, but it doesn't have to be. The word anointed one here in Hebrew is the word Mashiach. So it sounds like Messiah, But I did a search in Hebrew, and that word wasn't just used for the Messiah. It was a word used for priests. When you would anoint a priest for ministry, he would become a Mashiach, an anointed individual. Or it could also mean Messiah. It just depended on the context. And some languages are that way. One word can have multiple meanings, and if you're part of that culture, you know. But if you're an outsider like us looking in, you have to work a little harder. But in this case, I'm convinced this is talking about the Messiah and not just some priest. Why? Because it said there in verse 26, this anointed one is going to be cut off. And that's a Hebrew phrase that's very interesting, because that was a punishment that was reserved either for criminals or people who had committed serious religious offenses in Israel. You could be cut off. Now that word, again, has a couple of meanings. Number one, if you were cut off, it could mean you were forced to leave Israel. You're no longer part of our culture, our society. You're out of here. You're not welcome. Or if the offense was strong enough, you could be executed. Same word, cut off. And in this case, it talks about an anointed one being cut off and having nothing. I believe that has to be a reference to the Messiah, Jesus, right? Anointed one, Mashiach, cut off, serious punishment for something, and having nothing. Well, you take somebody's life, they have nothing. And I think it fits perfectly with what Isaiah, in this really famous passage, says about Jesus. Isaiah 53, verse 8. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and as for his generation, who considered that he was, now watch this, cut off, there's that word, and then he adds a detail, out of the land of the living. So he's not just cut off like you have to leave Israel. He's killed. He's no longer in the land of the living. Cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. So I'm seeing Jesus, I'm seeing the Messiah all through this passage here. And up to this point, I think I lost about 3.5 hours today taking Kaylin to the urgent care. So I haven't explained this as clearly as I wanted to. But I think I've made a relatively reasonable case for what I believe. But here's where we get into a problem. Because it has to do with this period of 483 years or 69 weeks, which is the total time put together, okay? So if you work through the numbers based on what we know from history, things don't add up. So what have we been talking about? There's going to be a decree. Gabriel's telling Daniel, there's going to be a decree issued that people will be allowed to go and rebuild Jerusalem. Remember, they're in Babylon. They're in captivity, but the captivity is coming to an end. And we know from history, and we know from the Bible, this happened when King Cyrus of Persia, I said Babylon, Persia's taken over Babylon at this point. He allowed Jerusalem to be rebuilt, and this happened in the first year of his reign. And as we've been reading in Daniel 9 in these verses, there's going to be a total of 483 years, 69 years times 7 that's going to elapse from that moment the decree is issued until Jesus is cut off or killed. So let's go to 2 Chronicles 36, and I want to read you where this part of the story begins. 2 Chronicles 36, verses 22 and 23, and it's very, very clear. Now, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, when it says first year, it means the first year of his reign, okay? It was that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation, another word for a decree, throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up. Okay? So that's in the Bible, and it's not just in the Bible. There are other sources of history outside the scriptures that mention this as well. Cyrus allowing the Jews to return home. Now, again, verse 22 says, Cyrus made this decree in the first year of his reign. Now, what is Daniel 9 saying? I've been repeating it. The Messiah would lose his life, he would be killed 483 years later, 69 weeks times 7. So, if the Bible's true, and we believe it is, all we have to do is figure out the math and it ought to fit perfectly, right? So the question you have to ask is this: when did Jesus die? A lot of people grow up, and I grew up believing this, that Jesus was born on 0 AD, or the first day of the year, AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, and he died at 33 AD. And that's not actually true. And I don't have time to go all through it, but I gave you a link in your outline. If you really are interested, it's a great place to get started, this little link. I am convinced, and this is actually a very simple link. It'll get you started, and there's a lot more complicated stuff out there if you want to chase it down. But I am convinced he was born somewhere between 6 and 5 BC, which would mean he was crucified around AD 27. So 6 to 5 years before Christ, even though it wasn't technically true, and 27 AD. And that means, so let's just make the argument. Let's say he died in AD 27, 28, somewhere in there, right? And we know there's 483 years from the time Cyrus makes this proclamation that the Jews can return home, and the year that the Messiah dies. So essentially, if we count backward from AD 27 or 28, whatever in there, and we count backward 483 years, 69 weeks times 7, then the year that Cyrus issued his decree, the first year of his reign, should have been 456 BC. The numbers ought to work. But here's the problem. And this is a big issue with people who are into biblical criticism, and that's a technical word, people that try to analyze the Bible. It doesn't mean they're critical per se as in bad-mouthing it. It means they're trying to analyze it and come up with arguments for and against it. And the problem is, when they read the historical accounts we have, history tells us that Cyrus became king in 538 BC. And that's not a 1 or 2 year difference. That's an 82-year difference. And that presents a problem. Because if the Bible is true, then the numbers ought to add up. If the Bible is true, then Cyrus should have become king in 456 BC. And yet every contemporary, if you go to Wikipedia, if you go to, ancienthistory.com, I made that up, but sites like that, they're all going to tell you Cyrus became king in 538 BC. And so the argument people make is, well, obviously the Bible's not true. Because every significant contemporary historian, secular, and a lot of Christian ones, say no, the numbers don't match. The Bible can't be true in this, and they try to explain it away, or they try to reformulate it. But, and this is where I'm going to kind of wrap it up here, at least for me, this discrepancy is not a problem, because in my view, and what did I just say? In my view, this is a case of history getting it wrong. And unlike people, there's two groups of people when it comes to history versus the Bible. There's the group that always chooses what historians say, the consensus, over the Bible. I'm not in that group. For right or for wrong, I don't live that way. I will always choose the Bible, even if everybody else says differently. I will choose the Bible. And in some cases, you find yourself looking like, really ignorant when you do that. I know. But in this case, I have a very good reason that I can pass along to you about why I believe this, and it's based on what we know about the calendar system that people use. And I'm going to there's a lot of detail here, and again, I've tried to really summarize it to make it clear. The man whose system we use that began the modern calendar, his name was Ptolemy, not the same Ptolemy that came out of Alexander's empire. This was years and years later. And he was a man who lived from AD 70 to 161. And this guy really was a genius. I mean, incredibly intelligent. He was an astronomer, he was a geographer, and that's how he got involved in calendars, because he could chart the stars and the movement of astronomy, and he could tell years and movement of months and weeks and all that. And so he began working on calendars based on his information, and his calendars were incredibly accurate. We really can't do any better today, especially when he records history from the time of about Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great lived roughly 400 years before him. Alexander's life was short. It was 356 to 323 BC. And from that time on, if you disagree with Ptolemy's calculations, good luck, because he really was brilliant. And it seems he really got it right, got it accurate. But here's what I'm going to say to you. Ptolemy lived from AD, after Anno Domini, year of our Lord, after Jesus, okay? He lived from AD 70 to 161. And that tells us he was living 7 centuries after the time of King Cyrus of Persia. And going back to Alexander, he had access to incredibly detailed records. But before Alexander, he was relying on sources that were not as exact as we might like. And I'm being charitable. To record events that had happened, again, centuries earlier. Now you think about our own country. Do we really know what was going on exactly, let's say, 200 years ago? We think we do. I've read the same history books you have, only to have somebody come along later and say, no, wait a minute, what you read in your history book, it didn't really happen that way, or it was, right? So if that could happen 200 years ago here in our country, and we're all Americans and we have that shared experience, try being super exact about something happened 700 years ago in a different society with people that spoke a different language and had a different way of thinking than you did. All I'm saying is this. Ptolemy was brilliant, and his calendars were phenomenal, and if I was near the man, I would have nothing but respect for him, right? But I think he got it wrong here, and I'm not saying I blame him. I'm just saying he had to rely on sources that were not always the best. And so I'm just saying this. When the chronology of the Bible disagrees with the dates that modern historians accept, for me, it's not an issue. I assume God knows more than historians. So Ptolemy may have been brilliant, but I believe he got it wrong, and the Bible gets it right.